All right. Well, welcome everybody. Looks like we'll get rolling here. 12:30. So we're going to start on time and roll through this. Kind of a fitting day to do this since we caught some rain here at least this morning, and much of North Dakota once again is receiving a lot of moisture today as well. So I guess before we get rolling with this, I'll introduce myself. I'm Justin Fruechte. I'm a forage and cover crop specialist with Milborn Seeds. Been here almost 13 years now, and so got to see a lot of what has happened with cover crop movement as far as changes and better practices with using them and putting up feed, and have seen what we've done in years like this in the past, especially in 2019 where we saw a lot of prevented plant acres as well. And then along with me, I've got Colin Geppert. Why don't you introduce yourself too, Colin?
Hi, I'm Colin Geppert here, also a forage and cover crop field specialist, and I guess I'll be monitoring a lot of the questions and that you guys may be having, and yeah, get started.
So we'll record this just so that we can have it for reference for people that weren't able to hop in here right now. But as we go, if you do have questions, be sure to just type them into the chat, and we'll pause and answer those as we're going. So that way we can, kind of keep it like a conversation, even though you'll type them and not say them, we'll still keep moving along that way too. So I think it's probably important to say this, that this isn't like it's not really a fun situation, not being able to plant your intended crop. And so, talking about other options, this is your plan C or D even. I think for most folks, they're going to try to do everything they can to get in corner beans, and with prices the way they are right now, I think that's a smart decision. But we also understand that there are just some areas that we've probably already deemed unplantable for a long time, and so we've already been fielding a lot of those calls as far as those acres that just, they're going to stay wet for another month or so. And so we know that they're probably going to be enrolled into prevented plant. And so this presentation is really developed under the understanding that we are choosing to enroll those acres into PP. And we've ran through the scenarios of that is our best option at this point. We're no longer to plant beans. And so we're going to enroll them into PP, and we got to do something. And so our options on those prevent plant acres are do nothing, which is cheap, I guess. You don't have to do anything. We're not going to do any tillage. We're not going to do spraying. It's just an option, okay? But we know that something's going to grow on those acres. And when something grows, more than likely, we're going to want to spray. We're going to want to control that weed seed bank for future cropping years. We don't want to be that bad neighbor. It looks bad. Nobody likes to be that guy. So if we're going to spray, we're probably going to have to spray 2 times. And Roundup's not cheap. And that's actually not that cheap of an option this year. And, I think it's worth saying that, like, you will have to do it twice. Those acres in 2019 that we saw that guys just chem fallowed, you can do it once right away, and then things are going to get really, really big, and then you're going to do it again later in the summer as well. I guess you could go ahead and you could just continue to work those fields. We've seen a winter and a spring like we've seen no other as far as wind, and I think everybody's probably not too excited to go work their fields and have them worked going into this next winter a year from now. And just because of what we've gone through with the wind erosion that we've seen on those fields, but it's an option. Okay. And then obviously the fourth one that we're going to talk about is doing a cover crop. So we're going to talk about the management of what it's going to take to do that, the potential that we can put up for feed and gain from soil quality as far as nutrients as well. So that's what we're looking at. So as far as the cover crop, which is what we're going to focus on, cover crop and feed crops, really, I think it's important to at least lay out that this isn't something that we've, that has just come up into the ag world in the last 3, 4, 5 years. It's something that's been around a long time. And so typically green manure crops were always used as just a plow down to increase organic matter. A catch crop was something that we'd plant in between a rotation to, suck up nitrogen that would otherwise have leached. And then a cover crop was just to, plant something, anything to prevent wind or water erosion. And, we had these three terms, and now we just kind of call it a cover crop. And a cover crop encompasses all these things and does all three of those things as just a cover crop, I guess. All right, so reasons why cover crops work not only on PP acres, but they work well after small grains have been harvested. We're sticking them in as winter annuals in corn and soybean rotations now too. The biggest thing though that I think we need to focus on these PP acres is, number one, it's going to suppress weeds. I'm not going to say you're not going to get a weed. You might have an escape here or there where you got a thinner stand of cover crop, but you're going to suppress most all of your annual weeds. We're going to infiltrate some water. And we've seen that in previous years too, where, after 2019, some of those fields that did have a cover crop on, those were some of the acres that, farmers were able to plant earlier that next year. We do start to move water through that profile. And so that's a good thing on some of these lowland areas that are just ponding with water already. When we pond water, if we're doing tillage, we're going to see some compaction issues. And I think anytime we get multiple root structures like we do in cover crops with tap roots from brassicas and branch roots from grasses, we do alleviate compaction. And so those root structures are amazing to just open up that ground, improve the soil tilth. Organic matter, this is a huge buzzword in terms of the carbon talk today and what we've seen over the last few months unfold with the carbon markets developing. And I think organic matter is a huge thing if we're looking at improving our soil and actually trying to put a dollar amount of what we can value these cover crops as. Usually we say we can gain 0.1% of organic matter when we have at least 6 inches of cover crop. And so we will get 6 inches of cover crop when we plant it this early, like we will on these acres. And so we can expect probably at least 0.1% of organic matter built. And then fixing nitrogen this year, this too is probably even more valuable. And so if we're not going to harvest it for forage, I would definitely talk you into planting some legumes just because the value of nitrogen is so high. And anytime we can build it instead of pay for it, we're going to try to do that. So that can be done with legumes, obviously. And then the feed side, and we're really going to focus on that here in this presentation as well. All right, the PP rule change, and Colin, add to this too if you'd like. Really what this is saying is it went from being that you had to wait till after the 15th of November to harvest that PP field as feed, silage, grazing, and now that rule has completely gone away. So we can plant something that we can hay it, after 50 days of planting, or graze it after 50 days of planting. We can hay it again if we want. So that's really, really valuable to this year.
Yeah, and for the other thing too, with being able to hay it multiple times, we have then a lot of different options for forages that we can be able to use for haying and then grazing opportunity.
All right, so I think here are 3 key takeaways or key points to remember when we're putting these cover crops on PP acres. The number one thing is thinking about your crop rotation. And so if it's acres that we want to plant back to corn next year, 2023, let's make sure that we're not using mixes or species that are all grasses. And so we would want to stay away from doing a solid stand of forage sorghum if we're going back to corn. Vice versa, if we're going back to beans, then it's okay to have more grasses in that mix. Stay away from things that can be a green bridge for pathogens that are going to affect that next crop. And we want to talk about, once again, building those soil nutrients. This is a huge opportunity to think about saving on your nitrogen bill for next year and trying to develop a high legume mix that could feed that corn crop in 2023. One of the things that we've seen on these acres, they might be able to be planted the 1st of July. However, if you're doing mixes with radishes, rapeseed, turnips, any of the brassica family, If you plant them before July 15th or middle of July, before summer solstice, they're going to want to flower. Okay, so and that's just the natural reproductive stage, or how they're going to want to reproduce is as the days are getting longer, they want to make seed and go reproductive. As the days are getting shorter, they want to put on vegetative growth and they won't flower and make seed. So that's something to think about if you're doing radishes. Just know that if it's July 1st, more than likely, they're not going to put on the deep normal bulbs like they do in the fall, and they're going to flower and want to make pods and seed, and they get bushy and big, but they don't put on that big deep taproot. Along with that, and I didn't put this bullet point in here, but I think it's something to think about. If you've got tiled acres and you're planting a heavy brassica mix, especially with radishes, we've seen it where those roots will get deep enough to plug tile lines, and that's not a fun situation. And so that too, don't plant it so early. If those acres are tiled and you're worried about plugging those tile lines, you'll make a mess, and you'll be digging those out in the fall and cussing out millborn seeds for selling your radishes that went too deep. So wait on those till probably the end of July as well. Okay, so let's get into some of the nitty gritty of what these mixes can look like and how you'd go about developing why you would use one mix over the other. One of the mixes that we're going to probably use a lot of is this mix that we call coverall mix. And this is something that we just kind of developed for this year because of the availability of species and the areas that these are going to be planted in. This would be something that if you don't intend to use it for forage, this is a pretty good mix that covers all crop types. So your diversity of plant types is very good. We've got a grass and millet, we've got brassicas and turnip and radish. We've got a cool season broadleaf and flax, and then we get a legume with crimson clover. And so this mix is going to be able to have all different root structures, which is a great thing for, like we talked about earlier, water infiltration and alleviating compaction. You should get really good ground cover onto this one too. And so we should just be able to plant it and leave it and have good weed suppression. There's not a ton of clover in here, 10%, but it's something that's probably going to build you just a little bit of nitrogen. And, conservatively, maybe give yourself 10 to 20 pound nitrogen credit for that next year. This one, it's going to go on at 15 pounds per acre. Pretty easy to seed in the fact that all these seeds are really small. And that's another thing I think when we get, or I guess historically, when we've had big areas of fields to cover in a short amount of time, a lot of folks are just using floaters and spreading seed and then coming back with a roller. And I think it's a really economical way to plant these acres. And so that's why we got this mix here with all fine seeds that don't need to be planted deep. They don't need to be drilled. And you can just spread it, roll it, catch a rain, and you're going to grow. The ideal planting depth on a mix like this is only going to be 1/2 inch anyways. So that's why rolling it's probably going to be a pretty good option. So checks all those boxes of keeping something simple. This is going to be a really cheap, economical mix too. There's nothing too fancy about it, but probably does a lot of things that we need to accomplish with this type of a blend. All right, the next mix here is Nutrient Builder. And this is one that we have used in the past on PP acres and have had it around for a few years, have tweaked it every year just a little bit. But this is the one that's going to actually build nitrogen for us. And we have had reports of up towards about 70 pounds of nitrogen credited from this blend. And so when we have all these legumes actually forming nodules, we can see that actually come into fruition. The radishes are in there, like I said, to alleviate compaction. They've got that deep, long bulb. The vetch, clover, sunhip, and peas are all legumes. We put a little bit of oats in there just for some quick ground cover, hold that ground in place. This is one too that I think that if you're willing to spend, a little bit more per acre, you will get your payback. There are a little bit more various seed sizes in this one, but it can still be drilled. It holds in suspension fine. You can broadcast it. If you're going to broadcast this one, I'd probably bump up your rate just a little bit because some of those larger seeds aren't going to do okay sitting on top of the soil, and you're going to lose some of them. Anything to add, Colin? All right, and the last one here for even if you are wanting to graze it, this classic trio is one that it seems like folks kind of like this one because it actually looks like a field. Like there's not a lot of unevenness in terms of plant types. It actually looks like a field should look in our minds. We're used to straight rows and every plant looking the same. Well, in the classic trio, even though there's 3 different varieties or 3 different species, it looks the same. And so I think that gives farmers a peace of mind as far as their field looking kind of nice. All these brassica species are going to have the very deep tap roots and do a really good job as far as opening up that soil, getting better water infiltration, alleviate some compaction. And they're really good at scavenging nitrogen. The brassicas have a very low carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so when they scavenge for nitrogen, whatever they capture, it's going to be released early in the spring. If you come back to these fields in the spring, there's not going to be a whole lot of residue from them, if any at all. And as that plant material starts to decompose, we can see some of that nutrients that become available for that year's cash crop. It's going to break down fast.
The one thing I wanted to mention here, these three mixes that we talked about here, these are, for livestock producers that can be grazed, but as well as, some of these non-livestock people that are affected in these, in the wetter areas and Southeast, North Dakota is, we know that they don't have livestock. And so this is an opportunity that you could be able to still have a diversified cover and still get some economical value out of it for the next year to be planted back into that cash crop. So, these 3 are really good for that.
Yep. And so those 3, they don't need to be grazed. They can be left. This next slide here shows you what it looked like. The picture on the right there was strip tilled into, and that was a field of nutrient builders. So it kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like as far as the amount of residue that you'll have to deal with and manage that way. Obviously the picture there on the left is just some nodules and what we can do as far as root structures and then building that soil. So the classic trio is one that if you knew you're just going to leave it, you didn't want to do any field work, but you didn't want to have to manage a lot of residue that next spring, that's a really good one. Like I said, there's absolutely no fiber or cellulose in those plants, and so the decomposition happens very rapidly. Okay, so now it's probably turning the page and moving to more forage options. And so we're going to go through a handful of these different scenarios and try to give you the best idea of what you should be looking at as far as what you should be planting according to your goals. And so the most popular option is going to be German millet. German millet is kind of the old standby millet. It's really tough in terms of its drought tolerance. It grows fast and you can have a hay crop in about 60 days. It's good quality hay. It's got a little bit, I don't want to say coarse stem, but it's definitely not like a prairie hay would look. So it might look a little bit rougher in a bale, but it's got a lot of leafiness and the palatability is very good. Crude protein levels are going to be anywhere from like 10 to 12%. And so it's pretty decent hay. As far as dry down goes, out of all the millets, this is one of the easier ones to dry down. As you can see in that picture, it has some height, so it's a pretty hefty windrow to cure out. But as far as the individual plants actually drying down, it's certainly quite possible and is easily done every year. So that's German millet. You're going to plant about 25 pounds per acre. Yield is going to be that like 2 to 3 ton dry matter per acre. That's really, really consistent. White Wonder is one that the only thing different in my mind is the seed head color. If you plant them next to each other, most years they look identical. They're both considered foxtail type millets. White Wonder might be just a little bit taller. I don't know. It just seems like one is more preferred over the other, depending on where you live. It seems like in Nebraska, White Wonder is more popular. In South Dakota, German is definitely more popular. I would say either one is completely fine. This year, there is a much larger supply of White Wonder millet seed than there is German. But as far as yield potential, quality, palatability, they're both good. The other single cut millet option is Proso millet. And I wouldn't say that this is a good option, but it's an option. And if it comes to it and you can't get your hands on any foxtail type millets, White Wonder or German, and you want a single cut millet, well, Proso millet will work for hay. But you can see in that picture, it's pretty spindly stuff. You know, there's not a lot of leaf to it. There's not a lot of structure in the stem. It's actually, it's got a lot of knots in the stem, so it tends to grow kind of crooked as it comes up. And it's just kind of, honestly, it's kind of weedy looking, but it will make feed. In 2019, we had a lot of fields of Proso millet, and it did just fine. It's actually very quick growing, very fast maturing. And some folks even said it was phenomenal feed. So maybe it's just fine for feed, but it's not, typically it's not as good as German or White Proso millet. Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the multiple cut millets. The most popular one is Japanese, and a lot of folks have started to use this even over German because we can get 2 cuttings off of it. Even in 1 cutting, let's say we get to the end of June and that's finally the time that we can plant. Even in 1 cutting, Japanese millet's going to be a little bit higher yielding than any of the foxtail types. The other thing I really like about Japanese millet is its saline tolerance is really good. And it seems like it does well on some of these mucky, low-laying pieces of ground that have just had, you know, they've been waterlogged for a little bit. Japanese does well. It's actually really, well, if you look at the seed heads, it's actually looks a lot like barnyard grass. And it seems like in the middle of summer when those potholes dry up, the weed you see is barnyard grass. So this Japanese millet has some similarities to that. And I guess that's probably why it does pretty decent in those areas. Feed quality is just okay. You know, it's a little stemmier stuff, but you will get, you'll get at least 3 ton per acre. If you get that second cutty, you'll probably gain another ton per acre as well. You'll plant about 25 pounds per acre. It's probably like a nickel more expensive than German millet, but it's worth planting if you can do it.
Yeah, like Justin said, works well in those saturated soils. And, you know, if you have an area that you can be able to fence off and have some grazing potential in the fall, you can do that with any of the regrowth that comes if you only do a 1 cutting.
All right, the other option as far as a millet that actually regrows is pearl millet. And pearl millet has, it almost looks more like a sedan grass in terms of its plant structure. It's going to be a little taller, wider bladed leaf, but a lot of leaves. And this is probably in terms of a nutrient analysis on a feed test, this is probably going to be your best quality one, just because the amount of leaves that it does have. But it does regrow really, really well. That plant will tiller up and stool out, and it just keeps on coming. And so, and you're like this, where if we can get that guy planted in the middle of June, there's years where we've gotten 3 cuttings of pearl millet off in a year. Or maybe you do 2, and like Colin was saying, you graze the 3rd, bank that for winter feed. It's a pretty good option to get a lot of feed off of it. This one, I would manage it a little bit different than your foxtail types. You know, German millet, White Wonder millet, we're going to let that one put on a seed head before we think about taking it for hay. This one, I would let it get about 3 foot tall, and then I'd make a plan to come in and hay it off. It won't have a seed head on at that time, but it'd be a lot easier to manage as far as cutting it and getting it dried down in that windrow. Pearl millet and Japanese millet, when we're cutting that one, let's make sure that we keep your cutter bar up. I try to have at least 4 inches of stubble there. You know, they're grasses, and so they have to have at least a bit of a blade of grass to actually collect sunlight, photosynthesize, and start to regrow. They can't regrow from the crown of a root like alfalfa. So keep your cutter bar up, and your regrowth will be a lot better on them. So the last hay option that I think is worth mentioning this year too is teff grass. And as far as like value per ton of hay, this is going to be the best option. So maybe you don't have livestock, but you want to capture as much value as you can as hay. This is the guy I'd plant. Teff grass, it's a really, really fine seed. And so you only need 10 pounds per acre. And so you're going to plant it just like you'd plant alfalfa. You're going to plant it really shallow into a really firm seed bed, and then hopefully you catch a rain that night. Because it's a fine seed, its vigor isn't as good as the millets would be. It just doesn't have that, it just doesn't fly onto the ground like millets do, or like a grain. It grows more like a grass. And so it seems like it takes a bit to get to 6 inches tall, grows pretty slow then. And then from 6 inches to 2 foot, it really, really grows fast. But like you see in that picture there, its leaves are narrow, its stems are really fine, and so it's beautiful hay. Feed tests are going to be 16 to 18% crude protein. It's just beautiful stuff. I mean, it originally came on the market as like the horse hay, and that's how how it caught traction. And now it's really nice hay. All sorts of folks have used it and had good luck with it. Extremely easy to dry down. That's probably one of its big benefits over a millet or a sedan grass is it's dry down. Cure time is quick.
Yeah, just like what Justin said, that it is such a fine stem or fine seed and small seed. It's going to take the first 2 weeks of its life. It's putting its roots down first, and then it's putting out its its leaf up. So it takes a little bit of time for it to officially establish and grow. Just like he said, after the 6 inches, then it can really grow and give you a lot of feed quick.
All right, so that's probably the all the options for hay that I would think about using. I know that there'll still be some folks that use oats or barley. It's fine, but it's probably not going to get you the yield as what the warm seasons would, being planted that time of year. They're going to have to grow through June and July and August, and so it's better to use a warm season annual than a cool season annual. So that's why I definitely try to promote those. But moving on to silage options, really the best option is probably going to be forage sorghum if you just want a single chop, high yielding silage option. Forage sorghum is very fast growing. It seems like within 90 to 100 days, it's ready to go. Typically, it has about 90% of the energy value of corn silage, but obviously we're missing the grain. In yield of grain, we still have sorghum grain being made on forage sorghum, but just does not contain the energy as what corn would have. But we do gain some protein, and maybe a 1 to 2% protein higher than corn silage would be. Things to look out for as far as management of forage sorghum. We typically like to plant 12 to 15 pounds per acre, and it can be planted in a row. And so if you've got sorghum plates for a planter, I would use that and lower your seeding rate down to probably more like 8 to 10 at the highest, and then plant it in that 30-inch row. If we're drilling it and we're using that 12 to 15 pounds per acre, I'd plug every other hole on your drill if it's set up for 7.5 inches, and then do it at a 15-inch row. If we squeeze those rows too tight with forage sorghum, we do increase the chance of lodging and it blowing down, and we're going to have a finer stem. So we want to keep those rows a little bit further apart just so that we get a girthier stalk and better standability. In the fall, when it comes time to harvest that guy, there's years where it doesn't dry down like we'd hope. And so it might be worth letting it freeze. And when we freeze with any sorghums or sedans, we can start to build prussic acid in the plant. The only danger there is if we were to graze it right after a frost, we're going to kill livestock. But if you let that plant stand out there for 7 to 10 days, the prussic acid dissipates out from the plant, and it's no longer an issue. Even if we're chopping it for silage and we chopped it within a few days of that frost event, most of the time fermentation will decrease that prussic acid, and it's not a concern when we're putting it up as silage. If that happened, like you had to chop that, within a couple days of that frost event, you'd still just want to be monitoring those levels as it ferments to make sure it's safe. But typically that's how it happens. All right, so sorghum Sudan grass is simply a cross between forage sorghum and a Sudan grass. And so kind of get the benefits of both. Sudan grass does regrow, and so sorghum Sudan grass regrows, but it's not quite as girthy of a stalk, and therefore our sorghum silage yields aren't as high with the sorghum Sudan grass. Little lower yield, but like I said, it does regrow. So maybe this is in an area where you've got the potential to chop it and graze it in the fall. This would work really, really well. So we can chop it a little bit sooner than forage sorghum. Usually it's around like 75 days when that's happening. And then we could get maybe we can catch 25 days of regrowth. Now we've got a foot of growth on there. We could graze that in the fall if it ties into the rest of our acres where we're grazing there over the winter. Yeah, anything to add on that one? Oh, there is something to add on these. We haven't talked about the BMR trait on forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass. BMR is simply the brown midrib trait. It's going to decrease the amount of lignin content in the plant. And so your digestibility is better. Anytime we have better digestibility, we've got more forage being consumed. And so we can possibly have better gains because livestock are eating more at that point because they can consume it faster because they have less lignin to digest through. So the BMR is in sorghum Sudan grass and in forage sorghum, and probably a good thing to think about if you're doing either one of them, just because digestibility and palatability is better too. Okay. So the next couple slides are some mixes that work well for grazing. And I think something to think about here, maybe we haven't thought a lot about, is just if we're able to graze these acres that are crop acres, our pastures were pretty stressed last year. I don't know anybody who didn't overgraze their pastures last year. And so sure would be nice if we could give them just a bit of a break. And it's an opportunity to bank a lot of winter feed. So even if we don't need the grazing, we plan to have enough pasture most years for our pairs. And so, it's hard to say, well, we're going to have 300 acres of PP and we're going to plant it all to a grazing mix. And now we're just going to go buy an extra 100 cows or whatever. It's hard to do that, but it is easy to say, okay, let's go graze our pasture like we typically do. And we have enough acres for, and then rather than, starting to feed at Christmas, maybe we can graze for another 30, 45 days into the winter and offset some feed costs that way. So a couple different ways to look at it, I guess. So the blends that I would look at doing are blends that have a mixture of grasses and brassicas. And that combination really makes for a nice diet. The grasses obviously is what they're used to, but the grasses are going to give you the most yield. And so we'll stick some millet, we'll stick some sorghum Sudan grass in these blends. And in the fall or not, it can be in the summer this year, that's going to be your high yield component that they're going to come in eat first. And that's where they're going to get their roughage from. And then those brassica species, the turnip, the Winfred, and the Graza radish, are really high protein. But they're also really, really digestible. And so that's a good thing and a bad thing. If we have too much brassicas in a cover crop mix, your rate of passage is just too fast and they don't properly digest the nutrients. It goes right through them because the rumen flow is so quick. And so we need some fiber in that diet from those grasses to slow down that rumen flow. So, that's kind of like the cover crop TMR blend with the grasses and the brassicas out there. Something that we can plant in June and July, and it does really well because of the warm season grasses. It's got a low seeding rate at 15 pounds per acre. And in this mix too, it's all low, or not low, but all small seed sizes that blend really well together, stay in suspension good. And then of course, like I mentioned earlier, it's something that you could broadcast on and come back and roll pack in. Everything in this mix regrows. And I think, you know, this year it's something that you could probably plant the middle of June, come back at the end of August, graze through it, and then probably capture another, 20 days of rest off of it. And then you come back late fall, early winter and graze the remaining regrowth that you had. So you would get probably a couple grazings if you so choose on this blend. The ranch hand, this is actually our most popular cover crop mix. And it's kind of the do all, cover any goal type of a mix because we have so many plant types in here. And so it's a good grazing mix to be planted in the summer because we've got warm and cool season grasses, brassicas, broadleaves, and legumes in here. And yeah, if your cows like diversity, this is the mix for them. They're gonna absolutely love it. Most things in here will regrow, but not everything. And so I wouldn't account for a whole lot of regrowth on it, but you'll get a bounce back of some of the species in here. But if you want to, feed your soil and your livestock, then do this mix. If you want to just get as much yield from grazing, plant premium graze.
The one thing about the premium graze is that we do have that BMR sorghum sedan grass in it versus the ranch hand has the conventional sorghum sedan, but still two really good blends. And yeah, you'll have a ton of grazing opportunity with it.
Just to give you a reference as far as potential yield and return, usually what we're looking at for stocking rate is like a pair per acre for 75 days on these PP acres. Like I said, this is something that we're going to plant fairly early in the year. And so it's not like we're waiting for a small grain harvest to come off and we're planting it in August. I mean, we're going to plant this in middle of end of June and it's really going to thrive. And if we get that regrowth, that's just a few more days there later on as well. So we can put up a lot of feed and have a lot of grazing opportunity with these blends. I think one thing to always remember is no matter what we do, it's probably better than nothing. And I think it's okay to get creative with seed you have, using some of that. We saw that in 2019. If you get stuck with some treated beans or something, throw them in the blend. Soybeans are easily, I mean, they're a great legume to fix you nitrogen, and when you don't combine them, you have even more nitrogen made just from the biomass that you'll build. They can be grazed. So just, I think that's good to remember. But if it's left bare, if you're chem fallowing it or you're doing tillage, the ground gets a little bit ugly. And we have seen that too, where we get major phosphorus deficiencies in corn that next year if we don't have anything growing. And so having something is certainly better than nothing on these acres that are wet.
Yeah, and then if if forage and feed is like one of our biggest priorities, I think there's, just like Justin said, like what's your next crop rotation? Simple, the single cutting millets that we get a lot of feed off of, and then we plant a rye in winter rye in August. We're going to have a lot of growth from that, so that we can then have some forage availability to be grazed or hayed or chopped for spring of 2023. So there's just a lot of options that we can think about when it comes to utilizing cover crops. And like you said, it's better to have something growing than nothing at all.
One of the things they made a few years ago was this My Seed Mix calculator, and it's a pretty cool tool. It's really no different than the spreadsheet that we'll develop a mix on here. So if you go to myseedmix.com, has all these species on there, and you can pick and choose what your goals are, when you're going to plant it. Then you can choose the species that you want. It's going to help you help show you the cost per acre as far as least to most expensive. And you can build that mix. You can actually just order a blend right from that website as well. It just goes right through our e-commerce site. But it's something that you could build it. You could then give us a call or email us that mix, and we can run through it with you, tell you how great it is or how bad it is, and then tweak it from there, I guess. So I think I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, that having these acres to deal with is certainly a burden, and it is kind of stressful because you didn't want to be in this predicament and you just want to stick with your plan A. And so if plan A is not an option and plan B is not an option, and now you're onto this, what should you be doing? Give us a call. I mean, at least we'll try to help you as much as we possibly can to run through the scenarios that are going to suit you the best, and maybe even get you further ahead in the long run than what you had hoped. And that would be our goal, is we can help you get extra feed, or we can help build your soils. And, after this year, you're in a better place than what you were right now at this point. That's all we had. Kept it pretty quick, wanted to move through all those scenarios and get you as much information in as quick a time as possible. But please reach out to us. Our website's a really good resource for all of these mixes and all of these forage options that we talked about. That's just millwarrenseeds.com. Certainly give us a call. I actually thought I had our phone number and email on here, and I apologize for that. But Colin, you just want to type that in the chat as far as our email address and phone numbers. And you can have that as a resource, and feel free to reach out. But if you've got questions, and we got some coming into the chat, type those into the chat right now and we'll address those.
One question that they had was weed seed production from coverage to worry about.
Weed seed production from coverage to worry about. All right, so I'll address this a couple different ways. The two different ways. If you're planting a cover crop, I think it's smart to make sure that you're getting that seed from a pretty reliable source. And the more the supplies dwindle, the more southern supplies will move up. And millet, for example, is one of those species that will move up from the south, and there will be more weed seeds that we don't want in that. And so making sure that it doesn't happen is certainly a smart thing to do. The other way to address that question is, will you make weed seeds from the cover crop you plant? Not just weeds, but like, let's say you plant pro-sow millet or buckwheat. Let's say you plant buckwheat, and now buckwheat goes to seed, and then you have volunteer seeds that next year. I think it's a concern, but probably not as big of a concern as what you may think. Just because our herbicides are a lot better than what they have been, we are way better managers of volunteers than we ever have been. Our pre-emerge chemicals work better. And so I guess, yeah, you might make some volunteers. It's no different than combining your corn and have volunteering corn come back that next year. If you plant a cover crop that has enough time to put on a viable seed, there is a chance that it will become a volunteer plant that next year. But kind of like what I alluded to earlier, watch your planting time on some of those brassica species and wait till after the middle of July. And at that point, you will really alleviate that problem of volunteers that next year. Any other questions?
I don't see. I put the contact information there.
Okay. Contact information's in that chat. Run through all those scenarios. And like I said at the beginning of this presentation, it is a great choice to make sure that you're running the calculations on what it looks like to enroll these acres in PP and plant a cover crop, or moving on to the next cash crop, and run those scenarios. And then what it looks like for making feed. I did not put prices and values on a lot of these slides because I think they're so variable. But to give you a guesstimate of what it would look like to plant a cover crop for expenses, Like I said, you're gonna have one pass of a herbicide before you plant your cover crop. Like you just will, because it's gonna be middle of June before you plant. And then your cover crop expense for seed is gonna be anywhere from $15 to $25 an acre. Your potential revenue for feed, if it's 2 ton of feed, it will certainly be worth at least $100 a ton. That would be really cheap hay right now. You know, is upwards probably around $150 a ton is what I'd figure for millet hay this next year. Teff hay is probably going to be, you know, $175 a ton. So you got a potential for $250 to $350 of gross revenue just in hay production that way too. So make sure you're running those scenarios, I guess. But if there's not any more questions, I guess we'll wrap it up. And then if you'd ever like to go back and watch the webinar, we will stick it on our YouTube channel and through our website, you can access it as well. So appreciate you jumping in. And like I said, reach out if you have any more questions. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.